Dedication. To those comrades of the old regiment who still live, and to the memory of those who, whether lying in unmarked graves in the woods and fields of their battlegrounds in the lone spot, secured by the love of their companions, or in the trenches where they lie with the hundreds who gave their lives for the republic they loved so well, or who after all the hazards of war, worn out with its hardships, sank into peaceful rest in the home graveyard among their kindred. Their death, quote, gave the last full measure of devotion, unquote. This volume is affectionately dedicated. In the publication of the many volumes that have been issued detailing the histories of the companies, regiments, and other organizations which made up the Union Army of the Rebellion, it has been usual to preclude such histories by a statement of all the causes that led up to the war and give a condensation of the whole political outlook. Certain phrases had therein been so general that they became monotonously reiterative. It was the earnest desire in compiling this volume to avoid that routine, and yet at the outstart some such preclude seems imperative, for it cannot be forgotten that the proposed history of the regiment is not alone for today, when by those who are survivors or witnesses of the Great War all the intensity of feeling is well remembered, but it is for the other generations to whom it will become a part of the history of a great nation. For the 155th Regiment of Pennsylvania Volunteers was a splendid type of the soldiers that the war produced, and was in itself an exemplification of the volunteer system and a proof of its great value. Upon this system rests absolutely the defense of the Republic and land warfare. In a military service given in time of war without compulsion, there must be strong, conscientious conviction to induce the self-abnegation involved in the perils and hardships of warfare. In the War of the Rebellion, there was thus created a patriotic body of men which had not its parallel in this century. In its ranks there was no distinction of station, caste, wealth, poverty, party, creed. Its method of election of its first officers by the vote of the majority was the ultimate of democracy. That the officers so elected, stepping out of the ranks to places of command, should receive the highest respect and obedience from those who created them, was the triumph of republicanism. The history of such an organization is more than the itinerary of marches made, more than a list of battles fought, more than a record of its killed and wounded. Its marches were the triumphal forward movement of freedom. Its battles, contests in which the right struggled with a great and powerful wrong. Its dead and martyrs consecrated to liberty. Its wounded, the living proof of what men dare for humanity, and its ultimate triumph the kindling anew of the great beacon that with a more glorious effulgence illumined the whole earth and lit the way to a larger hope and a fuller life. The whole world were earnest spectators, for it was known of all men that there was an issue involved of vital importance to civilization, the result of which was to encourage or dismay all who hoped for the exaltation of mankind. It was the great test as to whether, quote, a government of the people, for the people, by the people, unquote, should longer exist or should utterly perish from the earth. More than this, it was the final declaration that no nation could long exist when a recognized system of slavery gave the lie to all protestations of freedom. That slavery and freedom could not companion each other, for stripped of last of all evasion, the great rebellion was but a conflict between the two conflicting elements. The war was not a sudden conflagration. It was the flame bursting from a long, smoldering fire. The conviction in men's minds was not of sudden growth. It required all the last years of the nation's life to reach the ultimate conclusion. A condition of the public mind that could induce peaceful citizens to abandon the quiet ways of life, to leave home and the companionship of wives and children, parents, brothers and sisters, and all that made life delightful, and accept the dangers and hardships of a cruel and bitter war, should be thoroughly known to the readers of succeeding generations to enable them to understand why such men as composed of the 155th Regiment made these sacrifices and accepted these perils. In its original number of men, there were but 36 commissioned officers, and these, as stated, selected by the enlisted men from among their own number. Consequently, there were men carrying muskets. When these men were mustered out after 4 years of war and participation in more than 25 pitched battles, there was no interregnum between the soldier and the citizen, but at once they resumed their old or new vocations and developed into all that makes life memorable. From their ranks came men noteworthy in all ways in which men labor. Judges who sat worthily on the bench, attorneys successful in the law, surgeons eminent in their profession, literateurs, chemists, civil engineers, journalists, businessmen whose abilities made them millionaires, able mechanics, competent men in public office and in places of trust, bankers, ministers of the gospel, financiers, husbandmen, and in all places among good citizens, thus both in the field and in ways of peace demonstrating their ability. And greater and nobler than all, putting aside the soldier completely and utterly and returning to the simple citizenship from which they came, with unimpaired conceptions of right and increased respect for law and order and a fuller appreciation of the duty they owed to the great nation they had guarded so well. Rome gave, to the admiration of mankind, a Cincinnatus. The great republic offers hundreds of thousands of Cincinnati. Such men could not serve as soldiers, for the mere love of adventure. Their previous environment had made them averse to war. They had been reared where, quote, peace went tinkling with the shepherd's bell, and singing with the reaper, unquote. What so moved them could not but be of great weight and importance, and it seems part of their history that the conditions which impelled them should be clearly shown. The conditions that forced them in the beginning grew stronger as the war progressed, and the dreadful necessity of an appeal to arms became more evident, until the close of the war, when they were mustered out with a loss of 644 killed and wounded. A body of such men did not come out of an obscure atmosphere into the bright light of history, and it is due to them to show that not only did they act from earnest conviction of right, but their conclusion was well-founded, just, and inevitable. They, whom they fought, also battled with patient endurance and great courage. Their ultimate surrender did not abate a jot or tittle from their reputation or soldierly conduct, and it is the more necessary to show that forced such a war between two bodies of Americans, whose sincerity was proven by the sacrifices each made. For even at this day, when the conquered rejoice that they were not the victors and are more than content with the conclusion, it is urged that the soldiers of the Union were the aggressors, and the men of the Confederacy only defenders of their assailed rights. It is difficult today for one not educated under the baleful influence of slavery to understand how anyone educated by the nation at West Point or at Annapolis, and swearing without reservation allegiance to the United States, could ever be justified in arraying himself among the foes who threatened its existence, and equally difficult to understand how those taking the same oath without reservation could, as senators and members of Congress, either in or out of office, plot treason against the government they had sworn to sustain. After years, we'll find it still more difficult to reconcile the bravery of Southern soldiers with their reason for taking up arms. The comradeship of war and mutual respect for bravery has, after these dreadful years of slaughter, brought the blue and gray closer together, aided greatly by the fact that there was, which the Union soldiers, no individual hatred. It is good that this better feeling exists, and it is characteristic of the largeness and greatness of the American people. But That should not be forgotten which time will more and more emphasize that the one valorous soldier fought for the restriction and ultimate extinction of the greatest evil the nation will ever know. In full accordance with the spirit and intent of those by whom the nation was created, and the other, for the continuance and extension of the same great evil. To relate fully all that justifies this statement is not within the brief limits of this preface. It would of itself make a volume of undeniable fact. It is sufficient to here quote a few of the many utterances of the men who were prominent in the formation of the Confederacy of 1787, and to show that this interpretation was the general one, and also to show how and why the slaveholding states departed from the accepted original intent. The union of the states was not only in the Constitution itself declared to be imperpetual, but it was the evident intent that there was to be no other construction of the Declaration. Up to the outbreak of the seceding states in 1860, there has been but one attempt at succession, and this attempt, made by the same state that first seceded in 1860, was promptly and effectually quelled by President Jackson. In the formation of the colonies into the Confederation of the United States of America, there were many difficulties to be met and removed, and many unwilling concessions to be made. The necessity for that union, without which the colonies should not exist, overriding all lesser considerations. The Republic so formed, while avowedly a government of the majority, was really a government of the minority. The colonies were firmly entrenched in their industrial sovereignty, and with great reluctance yielded any of their rights to a centralized power. This feeling was not a question of latitude, but was shared by all the colonies north and south. To retain as much as possible individual sovereignty was their jealous effort, and the obvious way was for the states weaker in population to protect themselves against the dominion of those more densely populated. The establishment of an upper body, or Senate, composed of only 2 members from each state, regardless of area or population or any future increase in population, secured so far equal representation, and the establishment of such a conservative body of legislators had merit as well as precedent. At that date, the number of slaves held in the colonies was about 491,000, of whom some 46,000 were held in the northern states, and 445,000 in the southern states. A representation in the lower body, or House of Representatives, based on numbers would offer to these latter states so few members that their influence would be entirely submerged, and their strength in the Senate almost entirely neutralized. To remedy this, a concession was made in representation by which, in the enumeration of citizens, 3/5 of the number of slaves were added to the number which constituted the basis of representation. At that time, as indeed down to the last census of 1850, there was in the southern states only 1/6 of the whole population who were owners of slaves, so that the singular anomaly was presented in a so-called republic, not only of persons not considered citizens being made the basis for representation, given on the demands of those who only constituted 1/6 of the white citizens. This inclusion of slaves in the census which determined representation was not at the time treated with a large dread of the future. It gave so sparsely settled states a fuller share in the government, but it was considered a matter which would adjust itself as it was the general expectations and belief that slavery would become extinct. It is a question whether it would ever have obtained such a lodgment if it had not been for the policy of England towards the colonies, which forced them to receive the slaves sent them and to accept the slave trade. It was not with the early colonists so much a moral question. The slave trade was not dishonorable. Many of the old Puritan citizens of New England acquired wealth in the traffic. But slave labor was at no time the most satisfactory class of labor, was not for years greatly desired. The New England states had already begun to develop a tendency towards manufacturing, which afterward distinguished them, and for this, black labor was not adopted. In some of the New England cemeteries, the old monuments recite among the other merits of the deceased that they, quote, acquired a comfortable competence in the slave trade, unquote. The English legal authorities had decided that Negro slavery was lawful because the blacks were pagans. The old Puritans, also, had convictions in relation to pagans that were of the same tenor as the Jewish consideration of the Philistines, and it may be presumed that the pagan from Africa, who could be made useful as a servant, offered a more satisfactory way of assisting the Lord in carrying out his decrees than the slaughter of useless Indians. The southern states, with all the magnificent opportunities for manufacturing the minerals within their boundaries, were essentially agricultural. Tobacco, indigo, and rice were their commercial products, and cultivation and preparation of tobacco, the main crop, did not especially demand slave labor. Even in the early day, there was much consideration of abolishing slavery. The principal difficulty seemed to be the peril of freeing at one time such a mass of ignorant people. Doubtless, the certain loss of much representation had its weight also. Later, the moral question entered more largely into the subject. It is unquestioned that in the Second Confederation of the People of the United States, in contradiction to the First Confederacy of the States, the general conviction among the delegates as to slavery was that it would eventually cease and that it was a wrong to be corrected. Jefferson, in their Declaration of Independence, cites as one of the oppressions of Great Britain that she forced the slave trade upon the colonies, and speaks of, quote, crimes against the liberty of one people, unquote, etc., referring to Negroes. And in his ordinance of 1784, which was amended, became the Ordinance of 1787, specified that slavery should not exist in any territory now ceded or to be ceded to the United States, which would have included the territory claimed by North Carolina and Georgia, which afterwards became Kentucky and Tennessee. The prohibition as to this latter territory was removed on demand of North Carolina and Georgia, these states plainly refusing to join the Union of States unless the concession was made. Had prohibition been adhered to by Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Randolph, and others, all of whom were adverse to slavery, and Georgia and North Carolina left to their own resources, slavery would have died its natural death, and there would have been no Civil War in 1860. What disadvantages would have resulted in the Revolution of 1776 by leaving the states open to British occupancy would have been offset by the restricted territory as the seat of war and the absence of necessity to weaken our forces for the defense of the people who could not, because of dread of their slaves, furnish their quota of soldiers to the Union. As it was, these delegates allowed no absolute mention of slavery in the Constitution they framed, because, as Madison stated, they did not choose to admit right of property in man. Mason of Virginia, in discussing the Ordinance of '87, declared slavery to be a great wrong and that the government should have power to restrict it. Luther Martin of Maryland spoke against slavery. Washington, in a letter to Lafayette in 1786, speaks of slavery with abhorrence. In 1802, Indiana Territory, a portion of which afterwards became the state of Indiana, petitioned to be temporarily relieved from the prohibition of slavery because of scarcity of labor. John Randolph of Virginia was chairman of the committee which reported against it. Instances could be multiplied to show that there was, at the time of framing the new Constitution, no thought of any extension of slavery beyond the limits of the 13 states and such territory as was not included in the prohibition of slavery. This meant only the territory to which Georgia and North Carolina laid claim, which was afterwards made into the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. The general conviction was that slavery as an institution would die out, and therefore such concessions as were made in order to secure all the states in the proposed union were justified because of that certainty. In pursuance of this, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and other states were preparing to abolish slavery, and did so in 1780. The abolishment of the slave trade by all the states was provided for in the Constitution of 1787. This trend of thought and policy grew stronger in the northern states as it did all over the civilized world. Great Britain had freed all her slaves in the West Indies and had succeeded in having, by general consent, the slave trade considered piracy. The United States were parties to this agreement. Slavery, although in its very nature necessarily aggressive, might not have demanded in the southern states more than its right to reclaim runaway slaves. In Virginia and Maryland, the increase in slave families began to be burdensome, there being no outlet for their labor. The more southern states were not making a commercial article of cotton. It was an entire day's labor for one man to separate the seed from 1 to 3 pounds of cotton, and that there was labor enough for all needs was shown by the willingness to abolish the slave trade. Even in that early day, it was realized that free and slave labor could not exist together. The ownership of slaves created a caste, and the non-slave holders, constituting 5/6 of the white population, were considered lower in the social and political scale. As the free states grew broader in thought and policy, the southern slave states grew more narrow and provincial, and a cleavage between the two sections became apparent. There was much in the slave system revolting to one unaccustomed to it, and friction was unavoidable. Doubtless slavery would have fallen into decay and extinction as hoped and supposed by the founders of the Constitution, and the spirit of the compact would have been fulfilled. 2 events changed the whole condition. First, the invention by Eli Whitney of the cotton gin, by which one day's labor could cleanse 1,000 pounds of cotton. Second, the acquisition by Jefferson of the immense territory of Louisiana, including within its limits a large accession of land favorable to the growth of cotton and making a new field for labor. The southern states had by Whitney's process secured practically a monopoly of the world's cotton, with an unlimited demand for the product, and not only did inhabitants of the cotton states grow more attached to slavery, but Virginia and Maryland, finding a market for their surplus slaves, began to be defenders of the system they had condemned. Cotton did not immediately find a full market. There were prejudices to overcome as to the new process and a world to make familiar with the uses of the new material, and the cotton growers had not yet grown arrogant and aggressive. The morality of slavery was still open to question, and speech was unfettered. In 1794, the Presbyterian General Assembly added a note to its longer catechism explaining the 8th commandment, affirming that the biblical condemnation of men stealers, quote, comprehends all who are conceived in bringing any of the human race into slavery and retaining them there. Stealers of men are those who bring off men and keep, sell, or buy them, unquote. There does not at that time seem to have been any threat of church succession because of this teaching. In 1816, another General Assembly characterizes slavery as, quote, a mournful evil, unquote. In 1818, a succeeding assembly speaks of slavery as a, quote, gross violation of the most precious and sacred rights of human nature, utterly inconsistent with the law of God, unquote, and exhorts its members to, quote, to continue and increase their efforts to effect total abolition of slavery with no greater delay than regard for public welfare demands, unquote. Baptists of 1789 resolved that slavery is a violent deprivation of the rights of nature and inconsistent with republican government, and the members are exhorted to make use of every measure to extirpate these horrid evil from the land. If, in 1835, the Savannah River Baptist Association decided that slaves' husbands or wives divided by sale should be at liberty to take new partners, considering such separations among persons situated as our slaves are in civilly a separation by death, and they believe in the sight of God, it would have been so received that they should marry again to protect their own morals, and also to prevent censure from the church for not obeying their masters. That the cotton gin changed a black baby from a burden to a value of $100 may have possibly slightly influenced the Baptists of that ilk. This change in sentiment shows how the inhabitants of the slave states were departing from the spirit of those who founded the Union. Roger B. Taney, afterwards Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court in 1818, defending an anti-slavery client, said, quote, "A hard necessity indeed compels us to endure the evils of slavery for a time. Yet, while it endures, it is a blot on our national character, and every real lover of freedom confidently hopes that it will be effectually, though it must be gradually wiped away, and until it shall be accomplished, until the time when we can point without a blush to the language of the Declaration of Independence, any friend of humanity will seek to lighten the galling chain of slavery, and better, to the utmost of his power, the wretched condition of the slave." Unquote. In 1826, Edward Everett, who afterwards distinguished himself by his pandering to slavery, in a speech in Congress endeavoring to defend slavery as sanctioned by religion, was rebuked by John Randolph of Virginia, who said, quote, "I envy neither the head nor the heart of that man from the North who rises here to defend slavery upon principle." Unquote. Monroe, in 1829, in convention at Richmond, said incidentally of slavery, quote, "No imputation can be cast on Virginia in this matter, the basis of representation. She did all that was in her power to prevent the extension of slavery and to mitigate its evils as far as she could." Unquote. In 1831, after the Nat Turner riot, Virginia endeavored to inaugurate a system of gradual emancipation, and came within a few votes of doing so. On that occasion, no speeches of Garrison or any of his fellow abolitionists equaled the invectives against slavery uttered by Virginians. James Faulkner, afterwards minister to England, spoke in a letter to his son, forcibly in favor of emancipation as an imperative necessity. Even as late as 1820, after the struggle of the Missouri Compromise, Henry Clay of Kentucky, who had in his earlier day endeavored to pass measures to enable Kentucky to secure gradual emancipation, said to Scott, the delegate from Missouri, quote, "Now go home and prepare your state for gradual emancipation." Unquote. It was not alone that the slave states departed from the spirit of the compact of the states wherein extension of slavery was not considered, but it was the manner of accomplishing it that also incensed the North. Slavery at all times and all ages has been the creator of classes. In the South, where so small a number were slave owners, it became peculiarly so, and the slave power became a powerful oligarchy. It was compact, always aggressive, and always on the alert. It became necessary to defend their own institution, which was condemned by all thinking men outside of their own circle, in all ways and by all means. They became arrogant and overbearing, the more so as their demands were acceded to, and the compliance of the northern states, who also were yielding principle because of their interest, did not lessen this arrogance. In Congress their attitude was threatening and overbearing, and their threats of constant secession if their encroachments were denied. Slavery, from being esteemed an evil to be eventually removed, was upheld as a great good. Toombs of Georgia, threatening that he would one day call the roll of his slaves from the base of Bunker Hill Monument, was but a type of the Southern attitude. Not only was all discussion of slavery made a penal offense in their own borders, but it was denied in the Houses of Congress by a rule that was aptly called the, quote, "gag law," unquote. Their threats of secession became a constant irritant, for the nation generally had accepted the position of President Jackson, who, a Tennessean, an advocate of slavery, said in his proclamation against the nullification resolutions of South Carolina, as against the tariff, quote, The right of a people of a single state to absolve themselves at will and without the consent of the other states from their most solemn obligations, and hazard the liberty and happiness of the millions comprising the Union, cannot be acknowledged. Such authority is believed to be utterly repugnant, both to the principles upon which the general government is constituted and to the objects it was expressly formed to obtain." Unquote. In a subsequent statement, in a letter to a friend in Georgia in 1834, he said, quote, "The tariff was but a pretext. The next will be the Negro or slavery question." Unquote. Slavery practically closed the South to all who were not slaveholders or advocates of slavery. It ignored the rights of citizens of other states. A vessel entering the ports of South Carolina having among its seamen colored men citizens of a northern state was compelled while in port to have such seamen imprisoned, and only released upon her departure by paying costs of imprisonment. Failing in which, the freemen were sold into slavery. White men, not slaveholders, could not prosper because labor was made degrading. As a consequence, the states embarrassed by slavery were avoided by free labor, and became poor in comparison with adjoining free states. There was a contempt for labor and for those who labored, and an arrogant assumption of superiority over all those who lived through their own efforts. Northern men were, quote, "mudsills," unquote, and were so designated in Congress. At the outbreak of the war, they had an assurance, as sincerely felt as frankly expressed, that one Southerner had the fighting qualities of, quote, "5 Yankees," unquote. Ridiculous as both these expressions seem, in the light of events, they were promptly quoted as indicative of the condition of which slavery had brought the Southern people. It was the ignorance and fatuity of provincialism, the institution which barred them from the common thought and progress of all civilized peoples, of necessity built, was about them a Chinese wall of exclusiveness, and they became ingrown. They had retrograded from the wisdom of their ancestors, and for the luxury of idleness were relapsing into barbarism. Such a people could not keep step with the free North. There were but 2 classes of whites: those who were slaveholders or sustained by slavery, and a lower class, which became with each year more and more degraded. The situation was anti-republican, and carried the seeds of its own dissolution. There was no great middle class, not content in their constant aggression, with the right to reclaim their slaves, who might as runaways have found refuge in free states. They forced by law from every man called upon assistance in sending the fugitive back to bondage. Thousands, who personally made no objection to slavery and were disposed to take no part in its restriction, were outraged by this demand. It brought home to them the impossibility of a recognition of slavery without, from the very nature of it, being forced into being an active party to its continuance. It could not be otherwise. It forced upon them the conviction that the Republic could not exist, part slave and part free. And so it came to pass that when South Carolina made her first step towards active secession, and it became a conclusion that the inhabitants of the seceding states had reached the point where they preferred the slave institution to the union of the states, and were prepared to sacrifice everything to that end, in final disregard of the original compact and the intent thereof, it brought into the field in defense not a body of anti-slavery men, but a mass of men who preferred the Union to slavery. As a matter of fact, the great majority of the soldiers of the Union were indifferent to the slavery question, and only became interested in the slave, not as a matter of sentiment, but as a, quote, "contraband of war," unquote, to be used as a factor to defeat the enemy. The response to President Lincoln's call to arms was not an impulsive one. It was a steady, firm action that came from the slow-growing and reluctant conclusion that there was no other way. It was the more deep-seated because it was not the present result of fine analysis. There was no need of each volunteer going over in his mind the reasons for his enlistment. Doubtless very few did. It was an issue joined that he had long seen pending. It was in the air and required no justification. It was the grandest movement the nation had ever known. It was the exaltation of sublimity. Its ultimate was not foreseen, but there was no other ending possible. The contest was of necessity, quote, "et le mort," unquote. That the end that came was the best for all is without dispute, but it is due to the memory of the 155th Regiment, as a type of the volunteer of the War of the Rebellion, to set forth plainly the logical justice of the principle for which they fought. They in no way said that, quote, "the end justifies the means," unquote, and it is due to these brave and patriotic men that while they still live, the greatness and justice of their motives should be made clear. Future history will give them even fuller appreciation, and praise in their name will be recorded as among those who, quote, "led all the rest," unquote. O veteran, in whose gleaming eyes the glory of the past doth shine, in coming years the grandest prize, a nation's reverence, shall be thine, and gleaming eyes shall throb with tears at names that stamped on history's page shall I go ringing down the years. The heroes of this patriot age, like martial music sweet and strong, thy name with theirs shall ever be, borne onwards by the tides of